In our history classes, we learn the labels, and we do timelines. But what started it? Where did the Enlightenment come from? Yeah, the rise of modern science, absolutely. You see, up until then, knowledge was a matter of explicating texts. If you went to university, you were taught to read the Bible, the church fathers, the classical philosophers. And then science came along, and it was a dramatically new way of gaining knowledge. You go out and investigate nature, that was a totally new idea, and it was astonishingly effective. So people started asking, what is the essence of this new form of knowledge? And some said, well, it's the empirical method, observation and experiment. So the first philosophy to self-consciously base itself on science was empiricism. Truth is what you can see, hear, weigh, and measure. And so let's start with the empiricism. As you see, it's the first one on the Enlightenment tradition. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stay within the Enlightenment tradition right up to today and then go back and do the Romantic tradition. And you'll find that it's much easier to keep track of that way. Because historically, it kind of goes like this. They react against each other. And so if you go chronologically, it can be very confusing. And I found it was much easier if you take the Enlightenment stream all the way out to today and then go back and take the Romantic stream. Now, if you accept the truth, the idea that truth is only what you can see, hear, weigh, and measure, how would you express that if you were an artist? How would you express, what would that look like? Well, up until now, artists felt perfectly comfortable giving visible form to invisible realities. They might depict spiritual realities like God and angels, or they might use personifications to represent abstract ideals like love or justice. The heavens are open. But empiricism says it's not possible for humans to know anything beyond the sensory realm. And so artists began to say, we can only paint visual sensations. Their slogan was, we can only paint what the eye sees. So what was the first? Now, you guys have read the book, so this should be more of an interaction. Let's see if this works. It's a big room, so you'll have to speak up. What was the first artistic style that was influenced by empiricism? Realism, right? Realism. In other words, people began to say, Goya says, there's no reason why my brush should see any more than I do, which was his way of saying, I can only paint what I see. And so he portrays a terrible massacre of Spanish peasants by French soldiers, but he refuses to give it any spiritual meaning. Let me show you by contrast. Many people think he was basing it on this devotional image that was about the same time, and that he was intentionally subverting this long tradition of martyrdom paintings that was used in devotional art. In traditional paintings, the martyr looks up to heaven, confident that God will bring justice. But who is Goya's victim appealing to? The guys who are about to kill him. The martyrdom painting shows the heavens opening and the angels preparing the martyr's crown. You might not be able to tell that's what that is, but those are two little angels with a martyr's crown in their hand. In Goya, the heavens are closed. In fact, the church remains silent in the dark background as well, which is, do you see the steeple? And that's his way of saying Christianity has no answers. One art historian says, no other painter has seen the world more naked of saving grace. But of course, it takes a while for ideas to percolate down. And so compare Goya to a later painting by Monet that's obviously modeled on it. What are the differences? What can you see? First of all, there's no sense of tragic outrage, right, in Monet. Right? Goya highlights the faces so you can to emphasize the injustice being done to them. In Monet, can you even see their faces? No. Goya's soldiers are stiff and stylized, faceless. He turns them into almost a killing machine. Monet's soldiers just doing their job, especially the officer on the side who's preparing his rifle for the coup de grace. What about the onlookers? Can you see the onlookers looking over the wall? Are they horrified? No, they're just sort of curious. So Goya was still clearly captured by the notion that art should convey a theme, a moral, a statement. His theme might be something like the horror of injustice, right? Or the brutality of oppression, something like that. Monet comes closer to what the realists said they wanted to do, to paint only what the eye sees, just a visual report. Now, if artists are going to paint only what the eye sees, what does the eye see? And that question was taken up by the next ism, by the Impressionists. Now, everybody knows what an Impressionist painting looks like, right? It's little daubs and dashes of color, and most of them are very beautiful. But why did they decide to break up images into little daubs and dashes of color? See, we're talking about empiricism still, which claims that the foundation of knowledge is sense data, right? But we're constantly interpreting what we see. And so the goal of empiricism was to strip away all interpretation. Don't even interpret things in terms of discrete objects standing in three-dimensional space, just patches of color in your field of vision. Like if I look out at all you guys and I don't know your people, I might say, there's a patch of black, and there's a patch of green, and there's a patch of blue. When I was in college, I actually had a course on modern empiricism where we spent an entire semester talking about whether human knowledge is based at its most basic level. It consists of color patches. Have you had a philosophy class like that? Color patches. I am being appeared to redly. Have you heard that language? And so a classic book on art history by Jansen calls Impressionism the revolution of the color patch, because one of the greatest of the Impressionists, Claude Monet, wrote, when you go out to paint, forget the objects you have before you, a tree, a house, a field, whatever. Merely think, here's a little square of blue, here's an oblong of pink, here's a streak of yellow. And what was his point? His point was we need to get down to the level of raw, immediate sensations, just spots and streaks and shapes. Artists even began to talk like scientists. They said, we cannot know what the world is really like. All we have are observation reports, a flux of sensations running through the mind like a film strip. So as you can see, the Impressionists were not just painting pretty pictures. They were wrestling with questions of philosophy, of epistemology, of what is knowledge, not in verbal form, but in visual form. The empiricist philosophers were telling them that we mentally construct the world out of color patches, and that's what the artists were trying to convey visually. Here's how one historian puts it. He says, up until now, most Western thinkers assumed the universe had a plan, a design, a purpose, and that's what artists wanted to convey. But empiricism in science was destroying the idea that life had an underlying plan or purpose. And so, by the time of the Impressionists, man could no longer hope to achieve the expression of an ideal universal order. We had to be content with those small and commonplace fragments of the infinitely complex world. And so this is where you see artists began to portray a sense of fragmentation, like this painting by Degas. Look at the arbitrary cropping. Do you see the dancers with their heads cut off? We don't see the world that way. Even if I'm looking down, I don't see you with your heads cut off. That's not how we see the world. You see the off-center angle of vision. It's hard to see. The person in the front is also cut in half. This is the slice of life effect. It's intended to show a chance moment sliced off from the flux of sensations. Let me give you a contrast. Whoop, this is jumping. On the left is a painting by Leonardo da Vinci. Notice how he uses the traditional pyramid structure to draw the elements together into a unified composition and focus our attention on what's most important in the center. But for Degas, what's in the center? Nothing, right? Everything is incidental, happening on the side, partly cut off. Even the ballet rehearsal, which is the title of the painting, is partly obstructed by the staircase. What we get here is a chance point of view, as though someone had just happened to come in at the back of the room. You see, if science was telling us that nature had no storyline, no meaningful order or plan, then artists began to feel that art should not convey a storyline either. No narrative that ties everything together into a coherent whole. It merely records fleeting, temporary, fragmented perceptions. As Edgar Allan Poe says, art had no concern whatever with either duty or truth. Now, for many of us, it's easier to grasp ideas when they're fleshed out in visual form. So after seeing the implications of empiricism spelled out visually, how would you respond to someone who's an empiricist, who says, well, I can't accept Christianity because its central claims cannot be directly verified by empirical evidence? You know, it's kind of hard to do a workshop when I'm way up here, because I can't hear you guys. So
it sounds to me like they are defying the idea of intentionality and a formal and a final cause. Is that about right?
Yes, but they probably wouldn't have said it that way. But yes, they were.
They're making a philosophical statement of thinking they only believe things that are precise science, but it's like self-refuting.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one too. Yeah. Good point. That's what I was going to say. Oh. Yeah. The empiricists weren't as interested in math. We'll get to them next. We'll get to the mathematicians next. Yeah. Well, or a more general response might be, why do you think empiricism should be the test for truth? Does anyone really believe that we know nothing about the world except observation reports? I mean, they themselves, like you say, are making a philosophical statement. Does anyone really think the only ultimate form of knowledge is color patches? Besides my university professor and a film strip of sensations running through the mind? No one is really a consistent empiricist, not even they themselves. It fails the practical test. No one can live it. If you were here for my earlier talk, remember one of the practical tests. Can you live it? Can you take it into the real world and live it? Nobody is a consistent empiricist. In fact, actually, my next point was going to be almost what you just said. If the central claim is that everything must be empirically verified, can that claim be empirically verified? Yeah. So it's not a finding of science as a metaphysical rule. So it violates its own criterion for truth. It is self-defeating. And the irony is that the empirical method of science did not arise historically out of a secular view. It arose out of Christianity. See, the ancient Greeks did not respect the sensory world, right? It was the realm of mere appearance. It was deceptive, it was changing. People like Plato and Aristotle had no use for the world of mere appearance. But Christians, reflecting on the fact that God had created the world, means God created the world with its sensory dimension. God created us with our five senses to function in that world, which means it's a reliable form of truth. And the examples we saw this earlier today, when Paul said, these events weren't done in a corner. So even Christianity, and even its central claims, were publicly verifiable events. So that Christianity treats empirical truth as one strand in the rich fabric of truth. So there's a larger framework that gives it meaning. So let's go back to the scientific revolution. If the Enlightenment was spawned by trying to make sense of science, remember, they were asking, what is the essence of this new form of knowledge? Some says it's empiricism. Others said, no, that's way too superficial. Sense data? No. The apex of the scientific revolution was the mathematical physics of Galileo and Newton. In Galileo's famous saying, the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters, he said, are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures. So what philosophy did this give rise to? Do you know what ism this approach gave rise to? That's his artistic style. Rationalism, right. Ever since the ancient Greeks, Pythagoras and Plato, the paradigm of reason had been mathematics and geometry. They had tried to formulate philosophy along the same lines as a mathematical proof. Now, how would you already said it, but how would you portray this if you were an artist? Yeah, so it starts with Cézanne, and he said that artists should interpret nature in terms of the cylinder, the sphere, and the cone, almost a paraphrase of Galileo. And this became the springboard for Cubism. And everybody knows Cubism, that the objects was to break down things into little squares and rectangles. But why? Why did they think art should be about breaking things into little squares and rectangles? Their goal was to portray the underlying mathematical structure of the universe, to reflect nature's hidden blueprint. Eventually, objects disappear altogether, and you end up with pure geometric abstraction. And people like Modrien said that their goal was to reflect the universal rational principles of the cosmos. And these ideas don't stay locked in the art museum. In architecture, they gave rise to what's called the international style, and these glass and steel boxes became very popular with architects, even in climates where they were not practical. The roof had a tendency to leak. So what was the appeal then? One art critic says it seemed to be the epitome of reason, straight lines, rational thought. So the international style was giving brick and mortar expression to a rationalist worldview. And many of the same architectures designed for inside the buildings. Architects began to think of themselves as social reformers who would lead the way in transforming society according to a rational plan. The best known was, it keeps jumping. Anyway, the best known was a French architect nicknamed Le Corbusier, and he called his buildings machines to live in, because they had the functional efficiency of a machine. And this slide shows this was his plan for Paris. He wanted to raise the city to the ground and start over again. Yeah, anyone who's been to Paris shudders when they see this. What he wanted to do to that beautiful city. So geometry began to symbolize the imposition of rational control. And they actually Le Corbusier's plans had enormous impact because he promised that he would eliminate the disorderly areas of a city that were potential hotbeds of crime and sedition. And the example he offered was the growth of the early Christian church in Rome. He wrote, St. Paul of Tarsus was impossible to arrest while he stayed in the slums because police activity was extremely difficult. As a result, the words of his sermons were passed like wildfire from mouth to mouth. So Christianity became the illustration of the dangers facing city planners if they failed to practice rational planning and control. In the 20th century, architects persuaded many cities to build huge housing projects, promising that they would solve a host of social problems with one fell swoop, from poverty to crime to drug addiction. What were they doing? They were accepting the rationalist premise that humans are basically complex mechanisms, and their problems can be fixed by slotting them into a machine to live in. They literally said, if you put people in these housing projects, they will become more rational. These are rationally designed buildings, and so people will be more rational. And of course, they actually decayed into concrete prisons. They were dreary, they were depressing, they were seedbeds of crime and social pathology, and many of them were dynamited to the ground. I lived in St. Louis when this was dynamited. And as one social critic puts it in this quote, you see, the decaying housing projects still seen in cities around the world remain a visible expression of the materialist and rationalist conception of human life. So when ideas come out of the university and into public policy, then it's easier to see why they fail. That a materialist and rationalist conception of life fails to take account of our full humanity. And as a result, its consequences are inhumane. Now, Christianity affirms reason, right? In the beginning was the Logos. And the Logos means not only word, but also reason. The difference is Christianity does not reduce humans to complex mechanisms operating by laws known to human reason. We're created in the image of a transcendent personal God. And so therefore it leads to policies that affirm our personhood, policies that are humane and life-affirming. Now, another philosophy that inspired by science came a little later, and I'm talking about Darwinian evolution and and what's the philosophy that often people use? The philosophy inspired by Darwinism. Naturalism, right. The belief that nature is all that exists, right? There's no God, there's no spirit, no soul, not even a mind or free will. And John Searle of USC, who is himself a naturalist, calls it the religion of our time, especially among naturalists. So how did naturalist ideas filter down through culture? You know, what we're talking about here is kind of cultural apologetics. How do ideas filter down to art, literature, and so on? Movies, music. In literature, there was actually a movement called literary naturalism. Starting in the 19th century, novels and plays began to appear that portrayed human beings as merely products of nature, without free will, determined by their genes and environment. Virtually all the students I've taught have read books by Jack London. So have you guys read Jack London? I've read them, started reading them when I was 12, I think. What most of them don't know, though, is that as a young man, London underwent what one historian calls a conversion experience to radical naturalism by reading the books of Charles Darwin. He actually memorized long passages from Darwin and could quote them by heart, the way Christians quote scripture by heart. And he wrote about dogs to soften the blow, but his real message was that humans are nothing but evolved organisms with no free will, governed by natural selection and survival of the fittest. Just a quick example is it comes from a short story he wrote about an old Eskimo, an old man, who's being left behind by his family to die in the snow. And as the wolves close in to devour him, the old man ponders that after all, evolution assigns the organism only one task: to reproduce so the species will survive. After that, if the individual dies, what does it matter after all? Was it not the law of life? So the story pounds home the theme that humans have no higher purpose beyond sheer biological existence. Even the tone of literary naturalism was modeled on science. It aimed at a tone that was detached, clinical, and above all, value-free. No moral analysis. And so books appeared that portrayed acts of murder and adultery with clinical detachment, no sympathy, no moral, no redemption. And so Émile Zola, who was sort of the theorist of the naturalist, said, "I was portraying characters without free will, determined by the inexorable laws of their physical nature. They are human animals, nothing more." And of course, high culture filters down to pop culture. There's a famous episode in Star Trek. If you haven't seen it, you can go online and watch it, where the characters are debating whether the android, Lieutenant Commander Data, is a machine. Well, he's an android. Yes, of course, he is a machine. But Captain Picard responds, "That's not relevant. We too, that is, we humans, are machines, merely machines of a different type." Now, how would you critique the philosophy of naturalism, whether it's in a classic movie or a classic novel or a TV program? What do you think what would be a major critique? People don't live that way. People don't live like organisms. In fact, you know what was interesting about the Émile Zola? Émile Zola wrote the one on the Right, that side. Terrestre. It's a story of a married woman who has an affair with a man, driven by sheer animal lust. There's no love. And then they decide to murder her husband. But then they psychologically destroy each other until they both commit suicide. And very, very optimistic movie. I mean, the kind of thing you read when you want to lift your spirits. But what's fascinating is that when he wrote it, late 19th century, people thought, well, yeah, this looks like Crime and Punishment, right? They committed a crime, and then they couldn't live with themselves, and they committed suicide. So he wrote a new introduction in which he said, I absolutely am not writing about a moral theme. This is not Crime and Punishment. I was simply analyzing their character, and here's how he put it. I was analyzing living beings the same way that a pathologist analyzes a corpse. I was giving a scientific analysis of their psychological makeup. So all these people, he was trying to be a naturalist, and nobody could take it that way. That's the tie-in with nobody can live that way. Nobody could take it that way. No, these guys committed adultery and murder, and then they couldn't live with it. That's how everyone took it. At any rate, so that would be one good critique. What else? Well, actually, that is my critique. I was going to focus more on the fact that they taught that we have no free will. You know, the appeal of naturalism is that it always posed as tough and realistic. You know, we're going to show reality like it really is, without any of the moral, rose-colored glasses. But ironically, its main weakness is it's not realistic enough, because it cannot be lived out in the real world. Because by saying that humans are essentially machines determined by the laws of nature, no one can live like a machine. So there's the practical test of the worldview. The critics will often point out that the literary naturalists themselves did not live out by their own philosophy. It fails the practical test. Now, I submit to you that in the practical test, the Christian worldview wins hands down, because it teaches that we are created by a personal God, a supreme agent who thinks, chooses, and acts. And therefore, Christianity has the intellectual resources to explain why humans are personal agents with the ability to think, choose, and act. The last worldview in the lower story is analytic philosophy. How many of you have studied analytic? Because, yeah, it's if you go to a secular university today, most of them are analytic. With so many competing isms, some philosophers finally threw up their hands and said, the serious business of discovering truth is the task of science, not philosophy. The only role left for philosophy is to help out science by clarifying terms. It was reduced to a method for analyzing the concepts and language of science. This was a drastic reduction in the status of philosophy. And it was often called, it was originally called defining philosophy, linguistic analysis, and then finally analytic philosophy. It was the first time since the ancient Greeks that philosophy was saying it had no distinctive subject matter of its own. It was just the handmaiden to science. And so philosophy books became studied with symbols of formal logic that look something like this. Instead of making metaphysical assertions about the nature of reality, philosophers would simply analyze the logical structure of propositions. Now, what do you think would be the parallel in art? Yeah, one form of abstract art. Minimalism. If the analytic movement reduced philosophy to analysis of the formal structure of language, minimalism reduced art to analysis of its formal language. What is the language of art? Things like line, color, texture, shape, volume, and so on. Those are sort of the ABCs of art. In fact, minimalism was dubbed ABC art. Eventually, minimalists did not bother to create at all. They were mass-produced mechanically in a factory. An offshoot of minimalism called color field went even further. Under the impact of materialist philosophy, they defined a painting solely in terms of its material constituents. They said, what's a painting? Paint on canvas. To quote their own words, what's important in painting is paint. It's color and surface, that's all. This view of art was totally unprecedented in Western history, and human history. Art critic Susie Gablick writes, traditionally, artists have used, there's no known human society without some conception of supernatural order, and traditionally, artists have used art as a material means of reaching spiritual ends. Only in the modern West has the idea appeared that art has nothing to do with spiritual or ethical truths, that it's merely a way of solving formal problems of line, texture, and so on. And she calls this a view of art that has no remnants of transcendence. Now remember, we have only covered the lower story. These are the artists. You know, we tend to think of artists as romantics. And so it's usually a surprise to many people to discover, what? There were so many artists influenced by Enlightenment views? It makes a whole lot more sense of some of these styles if we recognize they were expressing views that they hoped would be based on science. I have a friend who's a New York City artist, and she's very much into. She's a Christian, but she's not. She doesn't think very critically about her art, in my view. And and she does these kind of color-filled paintings, and she says, my art is purely objective. This is not about self-expression. You think art's about self-expression, right? No, I'm about objective analysis of form. And that's how the lower story artists talk. So let's back up and look at the Romantic movement. We could summarize by saying, oh, it keeps jumping. If the Enlightenment artists were about portraying the scientific worldview as they understood science, Romanticism was protesting the scientific worldview. Because after all, the Enlightenment had proposed a metaphor of nature as a vast machine. And the Romantics said, how inhumane, how dead. So they proposed to replace the machine metaphor with the metaphor of the organism. And they adopted a kind of pantheism where God was the soul of the world, a spiritual presence evolving within nature, a life force. And how do you think you would express this if you were a visual artist? Think about it for a second. Oh, how is this jumping? Anyway, there it is. It was expressed often by a glow that almost seems to emanate from within nature. Do you see that? And of course, light is commonly used as a symbol of the divine. And so one art historian writes, the individual details are often effaced as everything blends into a harmonious unity, dissolving into the universal one, the all. You recognize the language of pantheism there, the one, capital O, the all. It was thought that the life force could be tapped by turning inward and probing myths, dreams, rituals, symbols. This explains the rise of symbolism. The inward turn also inspired the Expressionists. Instead of the Impressionists, now the Expressionists. They rejected the Impressionist idea the artist should paint only what the eye sees. And in fact, they were willing to distort what the eye sees if that helped portray inner states and feelings. So Gauguin paints the grass red. And Van Gogh makes stars that swirl like cartwheels. As Rookmacher says, they wanted to overcome the extreme naturalism of the Impressionists and find ways to include more than the eye can see. Around World War I, Expressionism grew much darker. The carnage of World War I was on a scale never witnessed before, and many blamed it on science and technology. These were the new weapons of mass destruction. Notice again, not only what his eye sees. So the images become much more distorted with sharp, jagged lines to express anger, anxiety, alienation. Now, with Freud and Jung, we enter sort of the psychological age, where this concept of the spiritual becomes more sort of psychologized, and the life force becomes the collective unconscious, which embodies the accumulated wisdom of the evolution of the human race. And it's a wisdom that can be tapped through the techniques of psychoanalysis. And so they actually used dreams and dreams analysis and so on. And that's why you get these kind of dreamlike images. And notice again the religious overtones. Jung called it to tapping into the healing and redeeming force of the collective psyche. Other artists decided the best way to tap into the life force was to eliminate all conscious control. And so they said the artist should not plan his work ahead of time, but simply let it grow organically according to its own laws. And so they would doodle random lines and play with shapes and colors, and even use chance processes like dripping or pouring paint. Finally, the life force, it becomes simply the flow of evolution. So the existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre says, there's no such thing as human nature because there's no God to have a conception of it. So just as species are constantly changing and evolving, so individuals must leave behind all stable concepts of what it means to be human, all concepts of right or wrong, and just immerse themselves in the flux of life by simply acting. And so you get what are called the action painters. They didn't plan their paintings ahead of time. They literally tried to create art through unpremeditated action. Now, there were some who stayed closer to the tradition of romantic pantheism, like Kandinsky. He was the first abstract painter, by the way, and he preached a very eclectic mix of Eastern and Western mysticism. And he argued that the way to overcome philosophical materialism was to get rid of material objects. In his words, abstract art would liberate mind from the harsh tyranny of the materialist philosophy and would become one of the most powerful agents of the spiritual life. So that's the goal of abstract art. It's to free the mind from its preoccupation with material objects and draw the viewer up to the spiritual realm to merge with the one or the all. Is it working? When you look at these paintings, you know, at least you understand what they're trying to do. In fact, and some painters took it even the next step. In Buddhist and Hindu meditation, what's the most popular mantra? Om, right. And what's the purpose of repeating the same single syllable over and over again? To clear your mind, to transcend rational thought, and to merge with the void or the one. Now, how would you express that artistically? How would you do a monosyllabic om? Or black. Right, the monosyllabic om becomes a monochromatic painting. And what? This is Ed Reinhardt, and he's best known for a series of black paintings that represent, in his words, a mystical ascent in which the mind leaves behind the world of appearances, which is composed of individual things, and reaches an undifferentiated unity, the divine darkness, beyond thought, beyond reason. Francis Schaeffer offered a fascinating phrase for this. He called it mysticism with nobody there. You know, it might give some people a sense of being lifted out of the ordinary world, but to connect with what? Not with a transcendent person who loves us and communicates with us, but sheer emptiness and silence. The abstract expressionist Mark Rothko painted several large dark panels for the Rothko Chapel. It's called the Rothko Chapel, and it's in Houston. Have any of you been to the Rothko Chapel? I went there with some students, and I have to tell you, in less than 5 minutes, they were ready to leave. Because, you know, there's no visual interest in large, black, they're actually dark purple, large dark canvases. There's no visual interest. Unless you know the philosophy that he's conveying, there's nothing visually there. But what was he conveying? The person who commissioned the painting said they expressed the silence of God, the unbearable silence of God. And shortly after finishing the paintings, before the chapel even opened, Rothko committed suicide. So a mysticism with nobody there is not enough to give a sense of significance and meaning. Pantheism says pantheism is really the flip side of materialism, because materialism says everything consists of material stuff, and pantheism really just says everything consists of spiritual stuff. It's not a personal God who loves you, who communicates with you. It's just spiritual stuff, or essence, substance. And who said it this morning? Water does not rise above its source. A non-personal substance, whether it's material or spiritual, cannot explain why we are personal beings. And what it cannot explain, it will deny. And that's why in Eastern meditation, the whole goal, what's the goal? The goal is to deny yourself, not in the Christian sense of denying, but to dissolve yourself into the one. The word, no, there's a word that means dissolving. What is it? It's not in my notes, so I can't think of it. but obviously, the goal is to dissolve yourself into the one. Let's talk for a minute about postmodernism. What time is this supposed to end? I don't have the schedule. Are we allowed to go to? And at 3? Okay, I'm going to run you through just postmodernism, because I know you want to know that. Because, postmodernism is kind of obscure, and a lot of us have trouble getting a hand on it. So the artistic expression of it can kind of help us. And interestingly enough, it starts with a kind of pantheism. It starts with Hegel, who actually taught that history is a gradual unfolding of a kind of pantheistic divine spirit. It's kind of a pantheistic evolution. And what he said then is that all ideas, laws, morality, religion, political ideals are products of this pantheistic absolute mind expressing itself through the life of the community at any particular stage of evolution. In fact, individuals do not even have original ideas of their own. They're just unconscious tools of the universal mind or spirit expressed through the community. Now, can you see what this would lead to if it was secularized? People like Marx immediately secularized this, and they kept the notion that the ideas are unconscious tools of larger spiritual forces in the community, that they are little more than mouthpieces for communities based on race, class, gender, sexual identity, and so on. Is this starting to sound familiar? Political correctness, multiculturalism, speech codes, identity politics, intersectionality. Now you understand what's going on our campuses today. See, if you get Hegel, you get postmodernism. How would you express that if you were an artist? Basically, they said, if you as an individual do not have any original ideas, if you're just a mouthpiece for your society, what they did is just picked up images from your society and put them up and called it art. Postmodernism often summarized as the death of the artist, meaning the death of the very notion of individual creativity. It's a radically dehumanizing worldview. It implies that individuals are powerless to rise above social forces, that simply mouthing a script that was given to them. And in literary theory, this is deconstructionism. The author is said to be unwittingly voicing the scripts given to him by his various social groups, race, class, gender. course, sometimes these scripts will contradict each other. So the task of the literary critic is to disentangle those contradictory scripts, and that's called deconstructing the text. That's not as hard as you thought, is it? It actually does make sense. So Roland Barthes says, a literary text is merely a tissue of quotations absorbed from the surrounding culture. Deconstructionism in images. They juxtapose images in ways to suggest random incoherence to which the artist and the viewer can bring no meaningful order. This too goes into architecture. Remember the earlier modernist architecture with the glass and steel boxes? Well, this is postmodern architecture. Often the classic elements are exaggerated out of proportion to create a sense of irony, like the oversized column on the right. And even fashion. Do you recognize the painting on that side? And this is actually called deconstructionist fashion. Ragged edges, torn, shredded, inside-out seams, layered, asymmetrical. Just to show you how widely used. Okay, so what's the now that you know where postmodernism comes from, what's its fatal self-contradiction?
It asserts a truth that says there is no truth.
Yeah, essentially. It says there's no unified storyline to the universe. There's no meta-narrative, but it all rests on a meta-narrative, namely Hegelian historicism. Hegel's philosophy is often called historicism. So, right. I think we better let you go have your snack. Thank you.